As expected, there were quite a few people in the comments of my past two videos about boxing versus UFC who were triggered by what I was saying. Some of the comments were straight up disrespectful, and those people just get blocked straight away, and I delete their comments because respect is a reciprocal thing. If you come at me with disrespect, I'm going to come right back at you with 10 times the amount of disrespect. You see it? If you want to have a civilized conversation, you got to approach me in a civilized fashion. It's just that simple, all right? This video is responding to the people that actually are capable of disagreeing respectfully. Although there were a few people who seem to completely get the wrong end of the stick in terms of what these past two videos are actually about. There are people saying a UFC fighter or an MMA fighter would destroy a boxer in a street fight. Okay, but that's not what we're actually talking about. My original video was in response to people who are saying that boxing is a dying sport and that UFC is taking over. I came with evidence and showed boxing is not a dying sport and UFC is a long, long, long way from taking over. And that's just obviously one promotional company. The sport of MMA in general, a long, long, long way off taking over from boxing. So anyway, the main point of contention, which several people brought up in the comments here, was this approximately 1,000 MMA fighters in the world figure that I gave, okay? Now, I'll show you one comment in particular. This is a guy who's been subscribed to me for a while. Shout out to him, as you can see, Khabib, so he's a big UFC fan. And he says, to say that there are 1,000 pro MMA fighters in the world is the most wildly inaccurate stat I've possibly ever heard. Well, with all due respect, where is your source which proves that this approximately 1,000 MMA fighters is a wildly inaccurate stat? Where's your source for that? Because I have a source for the 1,000 MMA fighters stat. Do you have a source to show that this 1,000 fighters is wildly inaccurate? That's a question to you. So if you want to, and in fact, before I get to that, there was an individual here who said, McGregor never retired from MMA. Do your research before talking about MMA. And of course, I responded with, do your research, and sent him a link. So think about it, folks. He's saying Conor McGregor never retired from MMA. Meanwhile, in 2020, June 7th, Conor McGregor says, hey guys, I've decided to retire from fighting. Now, yes, McGregor has fought since, but Mayweather has fought since he retired. I referred to Mayweather when he fought McGregor as a retired boxer because I don't really consider Mayweather's career after Andre Berto to really be a legitimate boxing career. Okay? So whether you want to call Conor McGregor retired, unretired, whatever he is, he did retire in 2020. Maybe he's going to do a Mayweather and retire and unretire a bunch of times. But what I said was accurate. Conor McGregor retired. And what this guy was saying is a load of nonsense. He says, Conor McGregor never retired. Yes, he did. You're telling me to do my research. You're supposed to be an MMA guy, right? I'm assuming you're acting like you're some MMA guy. Surely you should know that Conor McGregor announced his retirement. Anyway, back to this 1,000 MMA fighters figure. If you do an internet search, this is the figure you'll likely come up with. It's from an article on the Business Insider website, and this is the source I was quoting from. It says there are approximately 20,000 active professional boxers and over 1,000 professional MMA athletes. But the article's a few years old now, so how accurate can it really be, right? Well, let's see how accurate their figure for boxing is first of all. As we can see here on BoxRec, there are currently 19,802 active professional male boxers in the world and 1,445 female boxers, giving us a grand total of just over 21,000 boxers. So Business Insider were absolutely bang on the money. The additional 1,000 obviously being people who turned pro after the list was compiled. If they were so accurate with their boxing stat, what makes you think their MMA stat is so wildly inaccurate? Where's your source for that claim? I've shown you my source. Where's your source? It says here on the Sports Quotes and Facts website that as of 2021, there are 689 fighters contracted to the UFC. However, this number changes frequently as fighters are frequently signed, released, or retire from the organization. If you check other websites like Bloody Elbow, it gives a slightly lower figure of 658. as of December 19th, 2021. Also bear in mind that thousands of businesses have gone bust over the past 2 years due to all the restrictions, which means that the companies who survive eventually end up with a much larger share of the market than they had before. This also applies to MMA and boxing. As smaller promotional companies have gone bust, the bigger companies have ended up with an even bigger market share than they had before. UFC has about 650 active fighters. I've seen figures as low as 160 for Bellator, but let's be generous and say that Bellator has 200 active fighters. That's about 850 active fighters in total between the two biggest organizations in MMA. Now, if you claim that the Business Insider figure of roughly 1,000 MMA fighters is wildly inaccurate, then where's your source? Show me all these MMA companies outside of UFC and Bellator that have thousands of active fighters on their books collectively. Right now in December 2021, is the true figure exactly 1,000? Of course not. I never said it was exactly 1,000. That's an estimate. It's a ballpark figure. But as far as I can see, it's not that far off at all. What do you think the true figure is? 1,500? I mean, that would be plausible, but that's not much different from the 1,000 figure. If you're saying the 1,000 figure is wildly inaccurate, then you must think that the true figure is what? 2, 3, 4,000? 10,000? I mean, you tell me. And when you tell me, show me your evidence. Show me your sources. Because as far as I can see, the only thing that's wildly inaccurate here is your perception of how big you think MMA actually is. UFC have done a great job at creating this illusion that it's somehow on the same level of boxing in terms of popularity and participation. I've got to hand it to them. Fantastic marketing job. But it bears no resemblance to reality. And whatever the true number of MMA fighters actually is, suffice it to say, it is nowhere near as high as the number of boxers in the world, not even remotely close. So all the points I've made in previous videos still stand. Nevertheless, let's try and see what we can find here. This is a list of the top 10 best MMA organizations or promotions in the world right now as of December 17th, 2021, so a couple weeks ago. As you can see, there are quite a few organizations on this list, and we're going to go through them one by one to try and find out how many fighters they have, active fighters, on their roster as of right now. Now, we've already talked about UFC, and some people might say, why not just go straight to the UFC website to find out how many fighters they have? Well, I did. The problem is that their list is not up to date because they've still got people who are no longer with them, people who have retired on this list. Like Khabib, for example, who retired nearly a year ago now, but he will still show up on the UFC list of fighters. So you can't really rely on that particular list. Anyway, UFC have about 650 fighters currently. Bellator, there's even less information out there in terms of how many fighters they have. But again, they do have a list here on Wikipedia. I've seen some figures that say it's around 160. Other figures say it's about 200 or so. So, I'm going to round it up to 200, just meet in the middle somewhere. So 650 for UFC currently, 200 for Bellator. Those are the two biggest organizations in MMA, and that gives us a figure of 850. So the next on this particular list after UFC and Bellator was this organization, Absolute Championship ACMAT, ACA. If we have a look at them, this is their current list of fighters. And the good thing about this particular Wikipedia article is that it shows the year of their last fight. So we can know that these people are actually active and it's not retired fighters or anything like that. So as you can see in heavyweight, those are the fighters they've got. Not that many. Obviously, a far shorter list than you would have with UFC. Light heavyweight, a few more. Middleweight. Again, if you want to count how many there are here, what is it? 100 or so, 150 maybe, something like that. Then we move over to the next on the list. Where are we at? Fight Nights Global. And that is here, which Fight Nights Global are now called AMC Fight Nights. They were called Fight Nights Global prior to 2021. They're a Russian organization that previously hosted K1 and other martial arts. Now, If you look at their Wikipedia page, you can't really find out much here by way of what fighters they have, how many fighters they have. You just find out the promotions they've put on. So perhaps they don't sign fighters to them directly, and instead they take fighters who are not with any promoters, or fighters who are with different promoters. I'm not sure how it works, but yeah, this is a promotional organization called AMC Fight Nights based in Russia. And as I say, I can't find how many fighters they actually have signed to them. But if you look at the number of events they've had, it says here they didn't have any events beyond February 2021. But then if you click this, AMC Fight Nights, they've had several events. They've had one event a month during 2021. So again, no real clue as to how many fighters they have on their roster or which fighters are involved in their events, whether they're signed to them directly or not. I don't know. If you've got any information on that, drop it in the comments. All right, next on the list is One Championship. So let's have a look at One Championship. This is a list of the current One fighters. As you can see, it's not a very long list. They don't have anywhere near the number of UFC or Bellator. And again, it might be, 150, 200 fighters here, perhaps. Next one here is Ryzen. If you go down, number 6 is Ryzen. And in fact, on the previous list, does it have? Yeah, it does. At least has the date that they were last active on the list of One fighters. 2021 for a bunch of them. There are some 2019s in here, but most of them you can definitely count as active fighters because it is 2020 or 2021, which to me is good enough. So again, maybe 150, 200 there, something like that. Ballpark figures here. Ryzen fighters, they've got far less. All right. Very, very short list compared to even the previous one that I showed you there. And these are the year of the last fights. And also, I'm not sure how many fighters are not contracted to these organizations, but they drift between different organizations. So, for example, in boxing, you've got fighters who will fight on an Eddie Hearn show 1 month, then they'll be fighting on a Bob Arum show the next month, or a Golden Boy show the month after that. Well, not in consecutive months, but you know what I'm saying. There are fighters who drift around and they don't have long-term contracts with anybody. Is that the case with any of these MMA fighters? I don't know. You let me know in the comments below. But where are we up to? One. So Ryzen don't have a very long list. And of course, as you go down this particular list that we're looking at, the rosters get smaller and smaller. Okay, so now we're on Invicta. This is the current list of Invicta fighters. As you can see, the roster is even smaller again. Go down the list a bit further to Pancrase. Not sure how else to pronounce that. Pancrase is hybrid wrestling. Okay. And the number of fighters, this is their current champions, former Pancrase champions. List of Pancrase events. Doesn't give a list of their fighters or how many fighters they have. Let's have a look at the number of events. Where was that hyperlink again? There we go. Number of events. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 events in 2021. Now, an organization that's putting on 6 events in 2021 clearly doesn't have hundreds of fighters, do they? If they're only putting on 6 events. And the same can be said for many of these other organizations, you know, pretty much all the other organizations that I've mentioned here. If they're only putting on an event a month or, 6 events in a year, so some of them 12 events a year, some of them 6 events a year, they clearly don't have hundreds or thousands of fighters on their roster, do they? If that's the amount of events they're putting on. So where we at? Pancrase. That's not the one. Then we've got M1 Global. So this is M1 Global here. Now, I'm not sure what's happened to this organization because they did some type of deal with the UFC, apparently, whereby they would then, they act as a feeder organization, a farm league, it says here, to serve the UFC so it can scout Russian fighters. This is how it describes them here. And the partnership was signed in 2018. Now, if you look at the list of recent and upcoming M1 global events, the last event was in 2020 in September. So they haven't put on an event since September 2020. Do they really have a massive roster of fighters if they haven't put on an event since September 2020? Are they defunct as an organization now? I don't know. But I do find it, an eyebrow raiser that they haven't put on an event in over a year. So again, if they've got hundreds of fighters or thousands of fighters, they're not getting any work at the moment, are they? At least not in this particular organization. So again, if there are hundreds and hundreds of fighters, thousands of fighters outside of UFC and Bellator, where are they? In this list I've been through here, we might get what? 300-400 out of this list? There or thereabouts. So if you add that with the original 850, you're talking about 1,150, 1,250, something like that, based upon these lists that I've been through of the top 10 organizations. So you're still very much within the range of what Business Insider said of approximately 1,000 fighters. Let's say there's 1,200 fighters. Is that wildly inaccurate? No, it's not. So again, if there are these thousands and thousands of professional, active MMA fighters outside of UFC and Bellator, please somebody show me where they are. Because there isn't anywhere close to that number in these organizations I've looked at so far. So where are they? Anyway, the last one on the list here, where we at, is Cage Steel. And this is actually a British company. And if you go to their website, they put shows on at the Doncaster Dome. Pretty much exclusively, that's where they put their shows on. So we really don't need to talk much about them. Come off their website. We don't need to, no disrespect to them, Entertainment at any level is good. But if we're talking about there's supposedly thousands of other fighters outside of UFC and Bellator, then a company putting on shows at the Doncaster Dome are not going to have that many fighters, are they, realistically? So again, if there are thousands and thousands of professional MMA fighters outside of UFC and Bellator, as some people seem to suggest, where is the evidence for it? Show me the evidence. Rather than saying that the 1,000 figure, the 1,000 estimate by Business Insider is a wildly inaccurate figure, show evidence that it's wildly inaccurate, if you can. Because I can't find any evidence to the contrary. But let's say you're right. You're clearly not right, but let's hypothetically imagine that you were right and there really were thousands of other MMA fighters outside of UFC and Bellator. If that was the case, then why aren't we seeing loads of unifications between these different companies? One of the biggest criticisms that people throw at boxing is that we don't see enough unifications, whereas UFC gives us all the fights we want, apparently. And I've pointed out the hypocrisy of this in the past, because UFC champions never unify with Bellator champions. And the response has always been, well, UFC has all the best talent. Bellator is mainly just washed up fighters and people not good enough for UFC. None of the Bellator champions could beat the UFC champions, so there's no need for unifications. This is the cop-out they always use. And it is a cop-out because wasn't Amanda Nunes just beaten by a massive underdog the other week? And there are countless other examples of huge upsets in UFC. There'd be even more world title upsets if UFC and Bellator had regular unifications, but they don't. In MMA, they're allowed to pretend that unifications don't exist and that those rules should only apply to boxing. And again, if these MMA companies outside of the UFC and Bellator really do have thousands of other fighters, as you seem to suggest, then how can you possibly defend the fact that there are no unifications taking place? Because you can't have it both ways. But the reality is that UFC and Bellator have the vast majority of MMA fighters, professional active fighters. There are lots of other MMA companies, but their stables are tiny in comparison. In boxing, there are 21,000 active fighters, 17 weight divisions, 4 champions per division, unified champions notwithstanding, which is 68 belts in total. That's potentially 68 fighters at any one time who draw a big audience by fighting each other. And that's not even counting the top contenders. If we counted them, then the number would surely be well over 100. UFC doesn't have anywhere near as many big potential matchups because the talent pool is so much smaller. Now, UFC might have a higher delivery rate in terms of making their big fights, but it's much easier to deliver a high percentage of your big fights when there's so few of them to make. For example, let's say there are 10 big potential matchups in the UFC at any one time. And I don't think the number is actually anywhere near that high in terms of fights that are actually going to draw a big audience. But we're using ballpark figures here, so let's be generous and say there are 10. If UFC deliver all 10 of those matchups, that's a 100% delivery rate. Whereas in boxing, you might have 50 big potential matchups, but you only manage to deliver, let's say, 25 of them, which would be a 50% delivery rate. So while boxing's delivery rate might be lower than UFC, boxing still puts on a higher number of big fights overall. 50% of 50 is still a lot more than 100% of 10. Just look at the heavyweight top 10, for example. You've got Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Alexander Usyk, Deontay Wilder, Andy Ruiz, Dylan White, Tony Yoka, Philip Hrgovic, Joseph Parker, Joe Joyce, Michael Hunter, Jared Anderson, Frank Sanchez, etc., etc. I'm sure I said more than 10 there. And contrary to what many people claim about boxing, lots of those fighters have fought each other already. Fury's already fought Wilder. Joshua has fought White. Joshua has fought Ruiz. Joshua has fought Usyk. Joshua has fought Parker. Parker has fought Ruiz. Parker has fought White, etc. Another one, Hunter has fought Usyk. Lots of big fights have already happened. And there are lots more big fights that can be made in just that one division alone. Now compare that to the heavyweight division in UFC. You cannot sit there with a straight face and try to tell me that the UFC heavyweight division has anywhere near as many big potential matchups. Come on, people, stop kidding yourselves. The UFC heavyweight division doesn't even have a fraction of the money that the heavyweight division in boxing has because it doesn't draw a fraction of the audience. And that's just one division. And speaking of divisions, to the people who say there are too many weight divisions in boxing because boxing has 17 whereas UFC has 8. Now, I have some sympathy with this notion in theory, but practically speaking, it would be financially counterproductive to confine 21,000 boxers to just 8 weight divisions. When UFC first started out in the early 90s, they didn't have any weight divisions at all. Do you know why they didn't have any weight divisions at all? Because they didn't have enough fighters to justify it. If they had weight divisions in the UFC back then, they would have been massively limiting themselves in terms of the matchups they could make. But as UFC has grown over the years, they've acquired more fighters, and therefore they've created more weight divisions to accommodate those fighters, which is exactly what happened to boxing. Boxing originally had 8 weight divisions as well, because back then there weren't as many fighters. But as the sport grew, they had to create new weight divisions to accommodate the higher number of fighters. Let's say you got rid of the light middleweight division and merged it with the middleweight division. So anyone between 146 pounds and 160 pounds was classed as a middleweight. If you only had 100 fighters in that division in the entire world, chances are they're all going to be a similar size. And there won't be many exceptional talents, right? Because you've got a small pool of fighters. There aren't going to be that many outliers in the division as far as people who are unusually big and strong at the weight either. But as it stands, there are 1,725 active professional super welterweights in the world and 1,351 active middleweights. If you combine the two, that's over 4,000 boxers between 146 and 160 pounds. If you have a pool of fighters that big, there are going to be far more outliers. Fighters who are unusually big and strong at the weight, and they are, for the most part, going to dominate that division. There are going to be lots of talented fighters left out who are just too big for 147, but too small to compete with the big middleweights. And again, this is a product of the sheer size of boxing, the vast number of participants it has. Now, some people might say, okay, Hatman, you got a point there with regards to light middleweight and middleweight. But what about the really small weight divisions where there's only 2 or 3 pounds difference? Well, it's all about proportion, because 2 or 3 pounds to a heavyweight isn't much. But 2 or 3 pounds to a man who only weighs 125 pounds is a lot because it's a higher percentage of his body mass than it would be for a light heavyweight or a heavyweight. So again, you might not think that 2 or 3 pounds is that much, but for a very small guy, it's actually quite a lot. When you've got a massive pool of talent like boxing has, if you don't provide opportunities for the talent by way of world titles and big paydays, then they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to seek opportunities in other sports instead, and that's going to hurt boxing financially. It's difficult enough to get a world title shot as it is now. But if you only had 8 weight classes, it would be even more difficult. And that would turn a lot of fighters away from the sport. Fans tend to support their local talent, especially in countries like Britain. Their local boxers are like local celebrities. And this helps to attract investment and grassroots interest. Young kids are often inspired by their local pros because they're thinking, if this guy from my local town has managed to pack out all these local arenas and make money from boxing, then I can do it too. When you take away opportunities, you reduce the grassroots interest, which then reduces the amount of money in the sport overall. Weight divisions create opportunities. Opportunities create interest, and interest creates money. UFC has less than 700 fighters. If they ever got to a stage of having 20,000 or 21,000 fighters like boxing, do you seriously think they'd still only have 8 weight classes? Don't be silly. If MMA had anywhere near 21,000 fighters, it would be completely impossible for UFC to control such a large percentage of the market as they do right now. Completely impossible. If the pie ever got that big, several other huge MMA companies would emerge to challenge UFC's dominance. And I mean legitimately challenge it. At which point, you'd have the exact same political problems as you have in boxing, whereby UFC and their commercial rivals would be reluctant to match many of their top fighters against each other. Boxing is actually a victim of its own success in that regard. The reason this hasn't happened in MMA yet is because MMA has yet to become anywhere near as big and successful as boxing. MMA is still absolutely tiny compared to boxing in terms of the number of fighters and the amount of money in the sport overall. The MMA pie is much smaller than the boxing pie, so to speak. In boxing, you've got these huge networks like Showtime, ESPN, Fox, DAZN, Triller is a new one, Sky and BT in the UK, all competing for a slice of this massive pie, all investing vast amounts of money. You don't invest vast amounts of money into a dying sport, folks. Back in the days when boxing was actually on the decline, you had all these ex-world champion boxers crossing over to MMA. People like Ray Mercer, James Toney, Shannon Briggs even. But now it's the exact opposite. Now you've got all these well-known MMA fighters crossing over into boxing. From Conor McGregor to Tyrone Woodley, Anderson Silva, Frank Mir, Victor Belfort, etc. Why? Because boxing's where the money's at, people. Even the current UFC heavyweight champion, Francis Ngannou, is threatening to walk away from UFC because he feels like he's being underpaid. And he's just the latest in a very long list of UFC fighters who've said the same thing. Anthony Joshua made $60 million in one fight against Andy Ruiz in their rematch. The money he made from that one fight alone could probably pay for at least, 10 UFC pay-per-view shows in terms of the fighters' purses. Maybe even more than that. Even at a much lower level, it's well known that people like O'Hara Davis made six figures for his fight with Josh Taylor. Six figures for a Commonwealth title fight. I mean, Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte made millions from a British title fight. Millions. You don't see that kind of thing at domestic level in UFC or MMA in general, folks. You just don't. Much less world level. So for Conor McGregor's first fight with the UFC, he earned £49,000. That was his first UFC fight, $49,000. UFC starting pay, it says for UFC 263, early prelims saw fighters paid on average £25,000. Main card fights, which is top-ranked fighters, broadcast on pay-per-view, saw a fighter paid on average £161,000. That is the kind of money that a main event pay-per-view boxer wouldn't even get out of bed for. Granddad Luis Ortiz would turn his nose up at that money. Here it says, are UFC fighters underpaid? One of the burning questions within UFC is whether or not fighters are underpaid, considering the chasm of average earnings between boxers and UFC fighters is slowly closing. Slowly closing. Very slowly. And you see, this is why boxing is not a dying sport. Because of the size of it, the amount of money involved, that is why there are so many promoters and television networks interested in the first place. If a sport is dying, people lose interest. The networks and the promoters will stop pushing it. They'll stop investing in it. You see it? That's what happens when a sport is dying. That's the telltale sign once the networks are, we don't want to put no money in it. Look at the amount of money they're investing in boxing now. You're saying it's a dying sport. In conclusion, boxing is not a dying sport. There are way, way, way more boxers than there are MMA fighters. You can't have only 8 weight classes when there are 20,000 fighters, people. The reason that you're able to have so few weight divisions in MMA is because there's so few fighters. Anyway, I'm out.